It is a privilege to greet you once again. Thank you to everyone who joins us week after week. If anyone is here for the first time, I want to welcome you. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe to the channel. Subscribing to the channel helps us viralize the reflections we make so that more people have the opportunity to listen. Thank you to everyone who leaves comments. Comments are also important because they help with the viralization of the videos and serve as feedback so we can understand the response of those watching what we teach week after week. Thank you all for being with us. Just as we started last week, we are going to talk about one of my books to get started and suggest an additional reading. For those who don't know me, I am a writer in addition to being a therapist. I have written 71 books. I am excited because in a couple of weeks, number 72 will be released, titled Silence is Dangerous. And today I want to introduce this little book, Wounds That Do Not Bleed. Wounds That Do Not Bleed is a book that took me a long time, practically 4 years, because I decided to include many testimonies, which has certain implications, because it is important to obtain written authorizations and other things like that, verify, etc., etc. It is a book that talks about emotional and psychological abuse and its effects. It is a book that deals with emotional and psychological abuse in different areas, not only understanding it as a crime, but also as a practice normalized by many people in many contexts. We talk about the wounds that are not seen, which, using a Shakespeare analogy, are the wounds that hurt the most. A serious social problem, the root of the problem. We talk about narcissism and the effect it has on people and why narcissism is associated with abuse. We talk about insults as a weapon, in this case, verbal. We talk about the silence of children in the face of verbal and emotional aggression from their parents. We talk about male aggressors and the characteristics they have and the tools we have to be able to help or distance ourselves and set boundaries with male aggressors. We talk about female aggressors because it is symptomatic that in this overemphasis placed on violence, there is a desire to emphasize that the only violent ones are men, which is false. We talk about the effect of emotional abuse and all the implications it has in the medium, short, and long term, about the exits taken, which are false exits that are not really exits, and about reconciliation when possible. And we end with the chapter, Love is Not Enough. Love as a word, as a gesture, just like that of expression, is not enough. A book that has 328 pages that has given us a lot of satisfaction. Many people are being helped by this book, so I want to recommend it and suggest it to you so you can acquire it through the Amazon.com platform in electronic format, in paperback format, and the hard version is coming soon. That is regarding my books. Today we're going to talk about David and Bathsheba. The Bible contains horrific pages. The Bible is not prudish. The Bible does not hide issues. Some people are amazed that so many horrible things appear in the Bible, but the Bible does not intend to hide or cover them up. It simply presents them. David, in my case, very personally, is one of those biblical characters for me who is contradictory and who I generally do not like. I think he is a person with more darkness than light. I admire him as a writer who wrote some memorable pages, some extraordinary poems, but he was an ambivalent individual with a series of huge personal conflicts, and who, unfortunately, in tune with the era, lived through terribly horrendous situations that, judged by today's standards, would deserve prison, would deserve to be in a very different situation than what is usually presented. I am presenting this topic because more than once I have been asked why I qualify David's act with Bathsheba as rape. And today I am going to explain in detail what happens by presenting the context in which the situation occurs. The incident is presented in the second book of Samuel in chapter 11. Verse 1 says, in New International Version of 1984, in the spring, which was the time when kings went out on campaign, David sent Joab with the royal guard and the whole army of Israel to annihilate the Ammonites and besiege the city of Rabbah. But David stayed in Jerusalem. There were times when one could go to war. David was, and permanently remained, a king of wars, a king of much violence. He was described as a man of blood, precisely because of the attitude he had. The Ammonites were an enemy people to Israel with very ugly practices as well, and they were also economic enemies, because in some way they hindered Israel's economic development. And Joab was the, let's say, general of the army of the king. He was the head of the royal guard and head of the army. And he was a henchman, that is. He was a servant of David who blindly did what David indicated to him without mediation of conscience. David sends them to war, and as many often do. In war, he stays in Jerusalem while the people go off to fight. Verse 2. Evening, David got up from his bed and began to walk around on the roof of the palace, and from there he saw a woman who was bathing. The woman was extremely beautiful. I have read so much nonsense about this verse that some of it is laughable, and other parts are angering due to the foolish things people invent regarding this. When it says that one evening he got up after his nap, he was sleeping. He took his nap, and he goes out to walk on the roof of the palace, the highest part of the palace. David's palace was located in a high place, and he saw the woman who was bathing. It was normal for people to bathe in their courtyards. Bathrooms did not exist. The bathroom is a much, much later invention. People did not use bathrooms in the traditional way we know them today. Septic tanks were invented later, and to bathe, people would go to the courtyards. But they didn't bathe naked. They generally covered their bodies and poured water over themselves to wash, more or less in the style of women in some places like India, for example, who bathe with their saras on. And in a way, that shows their bodies through the water, but they try to cover themselves while they bathe because there wasn't much space anyway. Now, she is in a private place. She's in her home. She is not making a public exhibition. There are people I have heard say foolish things, sort of trying to shift responsibility away from David and blame the woman, as many chauvinists tend to do, blaming the victim, saying, why is she bathing there? Because that was the place where people bathed, in the courtyards, because it was the place where they had water stored. They collected water in barrels. There was no tap water. They collected water in barrels or troughs. And it gives the description that the woman was very beautiful. Up to this moment, it does not present the woman's name. It is not telling us who she is. And the writer, by putting it this way and narrating it in this way, is telling us that the woman is not the most important character at this moment, but rather it is David. And what David does next. Verse 3. So David sent someone to find out who she was, and they informed him. It is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite. Bathsheba was most likely a foreigner who converted to Judaism, or her father was a foreigner who converted. Why? Because she was married to a Hittite, Uriah the Hittite. And why this situation? Because by tradition, Jews did not marry foreigners, not only because there was an explicit order in the Bible regarding marrying foreigners, but also because there were laws protecting inheritances. So marrying a foreigner was always a problem from an inheritance perspective. And that was established at the time the lands were divided and certain criteria were set. Not everything remained the same as in the time of Moses, but those laws were still in effect. Verse 4. Here the drama begins. So David, who already knew the woman was married, ordered that she be brought to his presence. And when Bathsheba arrived, he slept with her. After that, she returned to her house. Bathsheba had recently purified herself from her menstruation. Let's put things in order. David is the king, but not a king in the style of today, of today's kings, most of whom are simply emblematic or symbolic. No. He was a king in the style of the ancient world, who had total power and had the power of life and death over all his subjects. The only one who was totally free in the kingdom was the king. Everyone else was a subject of the king. He sends for Bathsheba, and the text says he slept with her. There is no consensual relationship there, no personal arrangement between the two. It is not a situation where she is accepting it. She is married to Uriah, therefore. She knows this is wrong, but the king is the king, and he forces her. He forces her in different ways, starting with having her brought to his presence. Without having the authorization to summon her to his presence. In fact, it was clearly established in ancient law that a man could not speak to a woman alone unless a family member or a husband, someone, was present. David ignores this. That is to say, David is saying, I am above the law. I am the law. There is a horrible attitude of arrogance from David. Bathsheba is speaking of the purification from menstruation. Notice that when the Bible speaks of Bathsheba, it never blames her for anything. Never. I challenge you. Find me a text in the scripture where Bathsheba is guilty, and you will not find it. But yes, regarding David, she had definitely purified herself from her menstruation. You have to understand this in the context of the ancient world. Menstruation is not a disease, but Mosaic law established that a menstruating woman had to isolate herself, could not touch objects, and could not be in the presence of other people because she was considered impure for the duration of her period. Most likely, the bath she was taking that day, the day before, in her courtyard, was linked to the purification of menstruation, to the fact that her menstrual period had ended. But since her menstrual period had ended, just as David rapes her the day she stopped menstruating, verse 5 says, she became pregnant. And she let David know. And that is to say, she doesn't stay silent. She sends word to him, you have gotten me pregnant. Her husband is at war. She is alone. Why does she notify him? She notifies him because she needs protection. Because if it is discovered that she has become pregnant while her husband is away, she will be stoned to death. And there was an element of horrible injustice there. Horrible. No, don't ask me to give you a reasonable explanation, because there isn't one. I explained it when I have spoken about divorce. Adultery was only ever blamed on the woman, never the man. Men like this scoundrel David would mess around with whoever they wanted, but nothing would happen to them. But if it was known that a woman had been in a sexual relationship with someone other than her husband, she was automatically condemned to death. Therefore, notifying David is not simply to tell him do something because you have a child, but rather please do something because I am in danger of death. If it is discovered that I am pregnant when my husband has not been around, they are going to kill me. And she isn't telling him directly, but she is telling him, you are to blame. So, please do something. And what does this individual, David, with a dark mind do? Because dark minds darken further when they begin to scheme. It is the evil scheming that leads people from one mistake to another mistake. And that is what David does. Verse 6. Then David sent this message to Joab. Send Uriah to me here. And Joab did so. Joab did not ask questions. Joab did not challenge. Joab said nothing. Like a huge number of people who lack the capacity to think for themselves and simply do what the local tyrant tells them to do, which is unfortunately a horrible thing when we lose the ability to decide for ourselves and let others decide for us. What did David do? Verse 7. When Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the soldiers were doing and how the campaign was going. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that Uriah held any officer position. It doesn't say anywhere that Uriah had any responsibility. Most likely he was just another one of the soldiers among the people. Uriah must have wondered, why is he asking me that? Why didn't he send a messenger to ask Joab? Or why didn't Joab send me with a document to inform the king? Why is he asking me? Uriah is no fool, and somehow realizes that something strange and odd is going on here because he is asking him. Verse 8. Then he told him, after having heard the report, which couldn't have been long, he then said, go down to your house and lie with your wife. As soon as he left the palace, Uriah received a gift from the king. First of all, who tells a person, go home to sleep with your wife, to have relations with your wife after having received a war report? It makes no sense. And second, what gift did he give him? Most likely inexpensive gift, so the man would understand. Of the king in your favor, on your side. He is telling him, lie with your wife. Because in some way, in David's dark mind, he is wanting to cover up his situation and is wanting, in quotes, to protect Bathsheba from a possible stoning by making it so that they finally pin the child on Uriah and not on him, who is responsible for this despicable act of abuse of power that forced her to have sexual relations with him. Verse 9. But Uriah, instead of going to his own house, slept at the palace entrance where the royal guard slept. This Uriah, who is a foreigner, turns out to be much more loyal and much more faithful than David himself. And that is probably the contrast for which this story is written, to show us that even if you are king, when you fail, you fail, you fail. And you are wrong. And a person who has no responsibility demonstrates having more fidelity than the king. Verse 10. David learned that Uriah had not gone to his house, so he asked him, "You have come from a long journey. Why didn't you go home?" Playing the fool, acting as if nothing is wrong. The king, who has power of life and death over the people. Up to this point, David is pretending to be someone condescending and a friend to Uriah, when in reality he is Uriah's worst enemy. And the answer that Uriah gives in verse 11 is worthy of being in the annals, of the response of faithful and honest people. At that moment Uriah answered, "The ark and the men of Israel and Judah are staying in simple booths, and my lord Joab and his officers are camping in the open field, and I am going to enter my house to have a feast and lie with my wife? As surely as your majesty lives, I cannot do such a thing." He received a direct order from the king and decides not to obey the king because he understands that it is not fair that all the people are at war and he is going to go to a feast and sleep with his wife when everyone is suffering, including Joab and his officers. That is a sign that he is not part of the officers. And it is interesting that he starts by speaking of the ark. It means he is a religious person, he's a faithful person, because when they went to war, the Israelites carried the Ark of the Covenant as a kind of symbol of having God's presence among them. And he starts by saying, the ark, that is to say, what represents God, and all the men of Israel and of Judah are camping in the open field, and they are having a hard time. And I am going to go to my house to eat a feast and lie with my wife? No, sir, no. I am not going to do that. Forgive me, but I am not going to do it. Verse 12. David, not content with that, says, "Then stay here today and tomorrow I will send you back." David replied. Uriah stayed that day in Jerusalem, but the next day. Notice the macabre nature of David means David invited him to a feast and managed to get him drunk. Despite that, Uriah did not go to his house, but returned to spend the night where the royal guard slept. This is macabre. It is a horrible David. It is a scheming David, an evil David. He is wanting, forcing the situation. First place, the others told him, "I do not want to participate in the feast because I do not deserve it. The whole nation is at war." But the king gives him an order, "You are going to stay and eat." And then he gets him drunk on purpose with the idea that the man, being drunk, will likely go home and sleep with his wife. But Uriah was so faithful that not even drunkenness could break down his ethics and his morals. What could have been going through David's mind? And I want to tell you that when you start down a path of evil, it's like a snowball. It keeps growing. It keeps growing, where you allow yourself one thing, then another, and another, and another, and another. And that is exactly what happens with David. Look at verse 14. Once again, the scheming David. The next morning, David, having learned that Uriah had not returned home, wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by way of Uriah. This is horrible. Every time I think about this incident, I think about how wicked David was, how horribly treacherous and perverse David was. He sends Uriah, and Uriah, with all the innocence in the world, carried his own death sentence in his hands. He carried in his hands that which would kill him without knowing it. And Uriah probably went back happy, believing he had been faithful to God, and that even when the king tried to persuade or dissuade him to go home, he did not go. Verse 15. The letter said, put Uriah at the front of the battle, where the fighting is fiercest. Then leave him alone so that he may be struck down and die. That is to say, David is not only a rapist who raped Bathsheba, he is also a murderer, because he intentionally plans a person's death. Many people die in wars, but it is one thing for people to be warring, to be fighting, as all wars are horrible. It is another thing to use the war as an excuse to kill you, to have him go forward, but leave him alone. Let no one accompany him so that he may be struck down and die. And that is David. The David who seems so wonderful and extraordinary to us, who threw the stone, who killed Goliath, and who sang so beautifully and wrote psalms. That David, a macabre, wicked, mean, violent, David plans the death of a man because he wants to cover up his own wrongdoing, his own rape of Bathsheba. Verse 16. So, when Joab had laid siege to the city, he placed Uriah where he knew the fiercest defenders were. And that is much crueler. Because the city is already under siege, because the battle is minor, yet Joab puts Uriah in the place where he knows there are still people fighting to defend their city. Verse 17. The men of the city, in this case the city of Rabbah, came out to face Joab. And among David's officers who fell in the battle, Uriah the Hittite also lost his life. Here they call him an officer, although in the previous verse Uriah does not consider himself to be among the officers. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The important thing here is that a death was plotted, and Joab participated as an accomplice to the death, and Joab agreed to do something evil. He agreed to commit an act of betrayal, because it is a betrayal. I don't know how to describe it so that one understands how abominable the action David has taken is, and in which Joab has participated, to murder an innocent man simply because the king has violated his wife and he did not want to do what he wanted, what the king told him to do, to cover up his fault. Then Joab, verse 18, sent David a report with all the details of the combat and gave this order to the messenger. When you have finished telling the king all the details of the battle, perhaps he will get angry and ask you, why did you go so close to the city to attack it? Did you not know that they would shoot at you from the wall? David was a soldier. He knew very well what fights were like. Therefore, he knew that approaching the wall was a risk. Therefore, he had to stay distant until he could lay siege to the city and be able to conquer it in a way that would have the fewest casualties possible. So Joab is thinking like a soldier and thinking about the attitude that the soldier David, who is king, is going to have regarding the situation. Verse 21, Joab puts himself in that position of imagining possible answers from David, saying, who killed Abimelech, son of Jerub-Besheth? Wasn't it a woman who threw a millstone at him from the wall of Thebes and killed him? Why did you get so close to the wall? Well, if he asks you these questions, answer him also. Uriah the Hittite, your majesty's servant, is dead. Joab knows. He knows his boss. He knows how David thinks. In fact, he knows how macabre David is, because he has not only seen him in this situation, he has seen him in many other events. So following his instructions, the messenger set off. Verses 22 and 23. The messenger departed, and upon arriving, told David everything Joab had instructed him to say. The enemy soldiers were prevailing against us, the messenger said. But when they attacked us in the open field, we were able to drive them back to the city gate. So far, so good. Meaning he is recounting what happened in the heat of battle. But he says another part next, which is what David is supposedly not wanting to hear here. Verse 24. Then the archer shot from the wall at your majesty's soldiers, so that several of our men died. Uriah the Hittite, your majesty's servant, has also died. That is to say, he ends with that phrase, knowing that with it, they will appease any potential anger from David. But it is all an orchestrated, macabre plan, plotted, calculated, and schemed against the innocence of a man named Uriah, and against the innocence of his wife Bathsheba, who has not only been violated, but is at risk of being murdered, and is also innocent of whatever might be done to her husband. Verse 25. Then David said to the messenger, tell Joab from me not to be so distressed by what has happened, for the sword devours without discrimination. Tell him also to renew the attack against the city until it is destroyed. In other words, David tells him, thank you because you did what I asked you to do. Thank you for being obedient. Thank you because you succeeded in getting Uriah killed. Yesil. Thank you. He says it in terms the messenger does not understand, but which Joab will understand perfectly. And probably Joab, the henchman, the evil one who followed David's instructions, must have smiled, saying, the boss is happy with what I did. What did you do, Joab? You murdered a person in the name of another murderer who is David. Verse 26. When Bathsheba heard that her husband Uriah had died, she mourned for him. It is evident. It is evident. She is innocent. Uriah is innocent. The guilty ones are David and Joab. David, above all else, is the one greatly responsible for this entire situation. She mourned because it is what was expected of a wife whose husband has died. What was not expected is that the mourning, which lasted 3 months, at the end of which, verse 27, after the mourning, David ordered her to be brought to the palace and took her as his wife. The word took is interesting. It is not that he asked her, do you want to marry me? No, you will marry me. You have no choice. Either you do it or you do it. In time, she bore him a son who was Solomon. However, what David had done was displeasing to the Lord. Obviously. We almost never read that part. Of course, it displeased the Lord, because God did not appoint David to be what he became, nor to do what he did. So in this story, what we have is a scheme of perversion, of wickedness. What lessons does this leave us? One of the great lessons is that power corrupts. Power corrupts. Be careful when you have some power, because when you have some power, you start to believe that power puts you above other people. And in this case, what has David done? David places himself above the law, not just God's law, but also civil laws, and acts as if he doesn't have to answer to anyone. At another time, we will study Psalm 51, which was the psalm he wrote after he realized the foolishness he had committed and the experiences with Nathan. When he finally understands that he was a foolish, wicked person. Aberrant in what he did. Now, the next lesson, and it seems to me that the way people read the scripture is horrible. Bathsheba was a woman in a time when being a woman meant having absolutely no rights. Rights. And in the context of having no rights, she is the victim, forced into a situation that she did not premeditatedly seek, and it was the king's fault for putting her in that situation. You know the story that the child she became pregnant with eventually died, and the son who was born later was Solomon. Now, David is married. David is not single either. David is married and also began that aberrant practice of the ancient world of sealing political covenants with marriages to produce children who would somehow seal those political covenants. That is why he had several concubines and wives. Speaking of women, Bathsheba had everything to lose. She was a woman in a world without rights. She was a woman in a world where she had limited rights also because she was a foreigner. She was an object. She had no rights of her own. It must have been horrible to live through that. And that is the circumstance she was dealt. The lesson is that Bathsheba is never accused in the Bible of any sin, none at all. And in fact, Bathsheba is mentioned by Matthew in the genealogy of Jesus Christ precisely because she, in some way, is also a redeemed victim, not by David, but because she is mentioned very little in the Bible. But you can see, even in his relationship with Solomon, that she is an honest person in what she lives and does, and she had to be a woman at a very difficult time to be a woman. The third great lesson: when someone wants to be faithful, when someone wants to act with fidelity to their principles, they will act regardless of the circumstances. Uriah decided to act, and he acted. No matter what the circumstances were, he chose to be faithful, even when the circumstances were all against him. Not even while drunk was he unfaithful to God. He was a faithful person. So the extraordinary character in this whole story is Uriah. Uriah, because he teaches everyone a lesson, regardless. When people come and say, no, it's just that the circumstances didn't allow me. Nonsense. Here you have one who disobeys the king. Here you have one who, not even while drunk, is unfaithful to God. So don't make up excuses. When you don't want to be faithful to God and his principles, you won't be. And conversely, when you want to be faithful to God, you will be. It doesn't matter what circumstances you have to live through. And the last thing is what is mentioned in verse 27. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord, which is, you can fool anyone. You can fool your family, your neighbors, your friends, or act like David, who acted as if absolutely nothing was happening, totally acting innocent, as if everything that happens by chance. I am not guilty, I am not responsible. Who can you not hide from? You cannot hide from God. Everything we do, God is a witness, and you cannot hide. If we make a mistake, God is not going to stone you, but God knows. When you make a mistake, don't be mistaken in believing that you are fooling God, because you can fool everyone except God. And it did not please God. And in part, David had to live with the consequences for the rest of his life for this sin and this situation of murder, lies, plotting, and violation. He had to live with the consequences for the rest of his life, which we also forget, and at some point we will talk about that when we discuss the experience of forgiveness. God forgave him, but he told him, the sword shall never depart from your house, and what you did in secret, another will do in public. And no sooner said than done. David had a miserable time for the rest of his life, especially with his son, Absalom. May God guide and direct us to be cautious when we have power, that we may be faithful people, even when circumstances are difficult, and that we understand we can deceive anyone except God. May the Lord be with you. May the Lord bless you. And may his Holy Spirit be with you This has been Pastor Miguel Ángel Núñez.